I don't have an assistant to help me with this, but
Do you show me to?
these are the names on back here of those who we lost in these shootings. We recognize that the sheer volume of people killed makes it impossible to name each one individually, and that this in and of itself is a form of violence that we're made to be complicit in. The greater the number of casualties, the greater the violation, the less able we are to mourn for each individual light that has been extinguished. And indeed, this is exactly how racism operates. By committing injustice against an entire group of people, racism normalizes the violence against them, and we are then made incapable of recognizing the unique humanity of the individuals that make up this group. And so in the wake of these shockingly violent displays of otherwise normalized racism, we are conscious to not minimize the personal realities of this violence. And so if you'll please join with me in praying that the souls of the deceased may rest in peace, that they be forgiven for their sins, rewarded for their good deeds, and that their loved ones find peace and comfort in dealing with their loss. And we pray for all those who remain in this life, but who are physically, psychologically, emotionally, and cognitively shattered by this event. Amen. But just as we are conscious to not lose sight of the personal, we are similarly conscious to not lose sight of the political, to not understand this attack as senseless, as some of our political leaders have done, but to understand it as entirely sensible within the race thinking upon which Western states are founded and sustain themselves. And we have been incredibly touched that in response to overt Islamophobia, the Muslim ban in the US, the Quebec mosque shooting, and the Christchurch shooting this month, that our most ardent allies have been Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they took place. And so we want to read to you a statement from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association that was released in response to the attacks, and it's also displayed here. It's not really that visible there, but I'll just read it out. NAISA and the 2019 NAISA Local Host Committee write this message in solidarity with the Muslim community in Aotearoa/New Zealand and elsewhere following the phobia. Everything we do on this land is premised upon the theft of Indigenous lands and violence against Indigenous peoples. And so we begin with the land acknowledgement as a way of reminding us of this reality. And so we acknowledge that the land on which we commune today has been the home to Indigenous communities for millennia, including most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And so with that introduction, it is my pleasure to introduce our friend, the brilliant Zainab Ahmadahi, who we've had the pleasure of learning from at Noor before during a talk she gave during Islamic History Month in 2017. And it's that video is actually a brilliant resource. So I hope you'll check out our YouTube channel and see that video if you haven't yet had a chance to. But for now, I'll just give a brief bio of Zainab. Zainab is a researcher, organizational development consultant, author and educator of African American, Cherokee, Seminole, publications is Indigenous Peoples and Black Peoples in Canada, Settlers or Allies, from 2009, co-authored by Dr. Benita Lawrence. And this bio is of course very short to capture all of the wisdom that Zainab brings with us here today. So please let us welcome Zainab, and the format, I'll introduce Aziza afterwards. Our format will be Zainab will offer remarks, and then Aziza, and then we'll hopefully have some time for questions from the audience in general. So thank you, Zainab.
Thank you very much. Wado in the language of the Chalaki and the Umuya people. I just want to say thank you to the organizers of this event, and to thank you very much for the invitation. I was very moved by this invitation. And as I was talking to someone earlier about how we kind of expect that communities that are experiencing some sort of tragedy, we expect that they're going to take some time to turn inward and deal with their pain and all of that. But time and time again, I've seen Muslim communities reach out to other communities, even when they're at the height of their pain. And so I'm very, very moved by that. And so, yeah, this invitation means a lot to me. So I just wanted to say as well, my youngest son lives in Aotearoa in New Zealand. He lives in the Waikato region, which is a very important region for the Maori folks. He lives there because he fell in love with a woman that lives there. And so, but it feels very close to home in many ways, this massacre. And he describes to me the outrage and the sympathy and the compassion of Maori folks who have stood up in so many ways. And I would like to see Indigenous people here do the same thing. They've stood up in so many ways in the region where he lives to show their support and to offer concrete protection and so forth and so on to Muslim communities in that area. So that's something I'd love to see here. So the terrorist who carried out the massacre was from another settler colonial nation. So he was from the nation of Australia. And he chose to carry out his act of terrorism in another settler colonial nation, the nation of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it kind of makes me wonder if the kind of white supremacy that is nurtured under settler colonialism is somehow different than other forms. And we can see, at least I see every day, what that narrative does to a person's mental and emotional wellness when they're living in an environment that's constantly trying to justify or disappear the brutality and the violence perpetrated on First Nations peoples, whether they be the Aboriginal people of Australia, the Maori of Aotearoa, or the First Nations folks of Turtle Island, North and South America. So it must be a real, I'm going to use a word, I hope I don't upset people's, but I think it just must be a real mindfuck to wake up every day and suppress the knowledge of what's happened in history and to suppress the intergenerational memory of the atrocities committed by previous generations that allow you to live. That suppression allows people to live on stolen land with a lifestyle purchased by genocide and stolen resources. And so I'm just kind of wondering, I'm not an academic, but there's something going on with white supremacy in settler colonial nations that I think might be qualitatively different than other forms. So as I look to decolonial approaches to anti-Islamophobia work, I just want to make a very few short points. And I think what we always hear from Indigenous folks and other folks is that we all need to educate ourselves about each other. And I prefer to talk about growing relationships over education. That's kind of the dialogue that is used in the Indigenous communities because a lot of those early treaties, by the way, that we made with the settlers, with the European settlers who came here, those treaties are referenced as friendship treaties, and not, they didn't use words like allyship or solidarity type of thing, which is, there's nothing wrong with, but I really strongly believe in the power of friendship and the opportunities that are created by forums like this. So that doesn't mean that there's, that it's not about, reading good books or taking courses and, connecting with teachers and stuff like that, but I just really feel that relationship building is kind of the foundation of education, basically. When you establish relationships and friendships with real life people, these dry historical accounts that you can read about are given life, and you can connect emotionally to these atrocities, and we can connect to each other as human beings who have survived a lot of stuff to be here today. And maybe we'll even fall in love with each other's stories of resilience and resistance and each other's culture and art, which has certainly happened to me in the limited experiences that I've had with migrant communities and Islamic communities. Wow, blown away by that stuff. And after educating yourself, you can look to your community and create opportunities for these kinds of dialogues in the community. So I'm affirming what's going on here for sure, but again, from an Indigenous point of view, this is really, really valuable stuff to make friends and create opportunities for talking about these issues. And to talk about, for example, the colonial foundations of Canada, the stolen land, the official policy of genocide, the history of enslavement of African and descended peoples, the fallacy that Canada is a peacekeeping nation when it regularly engages in imperialist campaigns, military actions around the world in support of white supremacy and capitalist expansion. So it's really important that we recognize the foundations of Canada's nationhoods, stolen land and genocide, the modern expressions of which are resource extraction and the destruction of Indigenous lands and waters, and the lack of resources that the resources that are taken away that make it difficult for Indigenous people to engage with healing the intergenerational traumas, the missing and murdered women, to address some of those issues, to deal with the prison industrial complex where Indigenous folks are overrepresented in every province, and the underfunding of services to First Nations communities and First Nations people. Which that funding is lower than the per capita rates for other Canadians, and the systemic abuse, of course, of children and families in the child welfare systems and various other abuses that we know that go on, so I don't want to belabor those points. So friendship. I want to talk about another set of ideas that I'd like you to take into consideration under this topic, and I urge folks in my community as well to think about some of the things I'm going to be talking about now. And I put a handout out there, and unfortunately it's labeled 3 Pillars of White Supremacy. It's on these 2 tables here. I don't have enough to share with everybody, unfortunately. Let me show you what it looks like. Okay. So if you can share that, I understand it's possible that you can put that up on your website as well, and maybe make copies and stuff like that if folks want to. You can also do a search online, 3 Pillars of White Supremacy, and you can get this graphic, and you can also download the original article that was written by Andrea Smith, who is Chalaki Aniumuia from my territory down south. And so she came up with this theory a little while ago because she'd been working with community groups in urban settings. And so she was working with a lot of people of color, migrant folks, Black folks, and Indigenous folks. And she saw some of the infighting that goes on and some of the ways that we're complicit in each other's oppression. And so she was trying to make sense and trying to help people understand the logic of white supremacy and how it impacts us all differently. So like any other theory, you can critique this theory, or you can expand on the theory. It's not meant to be the last word in anything, but I'm going to present it to you in a very simplified way today for the sake of time. But it gives a foundational understanding, I think, to how communities might better work together to achieve what we would call right relationship with the land and with each other. And to interact, to bring awareness to how we have been asked to interact with each other by our elders. I'll speak for my own community, our elders, and some of the treaties and covenants that came before the Europeans got here. Because, has anybody heard of the dish with one spoon covenant? Dish with one spoon? Okay, there's a couple of people here. The dish with one spoon covenant, sometimes referred to as a treaty, it was an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people who came here the covenant was made prior to any of the European settlers that came here. And what that is an agreement about how we would share this land, this territory, and how we would relate to each other in ways of peace. And it's all the language is very metaphorical and symbolic, but it's called the dish with one spoon because the idea is that the dish is basically the land that we're living on, and we're being asked to share the fruits of that land in a very specific way. So we all share that same bowl. We all take from that same bowl. We take as much as we need and no more. We always leave something there for the generations to come. Anybody that comes after us, there's always food left in the bowl. We use a spoon as opposed to other implements that we could use because, again, we don't want to scratch up the bowl. So again, it's all very symbolic. And it's really interesting because early in the story of the development of treaties and relationships between European settlers, there were leaders among the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe that signed the letter to King George. I can't remember what number goes after his name, but to one of the King Georges in England, asking him to come and share this dish with one spoon. And his response is kind of comical. It's kind of like funny, not funny, because it just went right over his head. And he wrote back and said something along the lines of, I'd really like to share, a table and have a meal with you, but we do eat different foods, so I don't know if it's going to be possible. Anyway, so back to Andrea Smith's white supremacy 3 pillars. So she talks about these different logics that support white supremacy, they underpin white supremacy. So in other words, she's looking at what in the narrative of the dominant culture justifies white supremacy. Why is white supremacy okay? Why is it okay to have Muslim travel bans and violate treaties and over-police black communities? Why is it okay that poverty is racialized and the vast majority of First Nations communities, for example, don't have clean drinking water, and on and on and on? Why is this okay? Why does the system tolerate this? And she argues that the logics operate very different with every community. And so when you look at the first pillar, if you've had a look at the handout, it speaks to this prevailing belief that African descended people are basically just beasts of burden, low IQ, basically inherently criminal, antisocial, and violent in their nature, okay? This is not science, folks. This is a belief system. So this is what the logic says. And so African descended people are just more likely, for whatever reasons, and there's a lot of people that have put reasons out there that are not very sustainable, but African descended people are just more likely to be antisocial, violent, criminals, and for God's sake, keep them away from white women, right? Indigenous peoples are always thought to be gone or disappearing, extinct. They've tried to disappear our histories and our cultures, most certainly. And this enables, this idea that Indigenous people are gone or extinct kind of enables the colonizer to feel vindicated and entitled to take Indigenous lands and resources. This idea that, that was a really terrible chapter in history, but it's done, so we don't have to concern ourselves with the crime of ongoing land theft and the ongoing kidnapping of children. I'm calling it kidnapping of children to put, to put into foster care and other things that still go on to this day, because that's all in the past, right? Along with that pillar as well is this idea that for those Indigenous people that have survived the genocide, we're all just stuck in the past because our cultures and our life ways and our spiritualities are all kind of like, not up to modern standards, right? We're all just archaic people, archaic and primitive. Primitive is a word they like to use. So our culture and our cultures and belief systems are not compatible with these 21st century values, and so we have to be brought into modernity, whether we're whether we like it or not, basically. And you hear that narrative a lot too. And then finally, with that third pillar, you'll see that there's this idea that there are these other people, these foreigners outside our borders that are just inherently dangerous, again, for different reasons, and again, a lot of different rationales. I'm sure you've read some of them or heard some of them. And their ways are just very different from us, and they threaten us. They threaten our democratic, peaceful way of life here in Canada, and they represent a threat to our Canadian values. So we always have to be vigilant against these others. We always have to make war against them, or prepare to be at war with them, or ban them from entering the country because we'll lose our identity to Sharia law or Mexican drug lords or what the hell. So everybody from these communities is a potential terrorist, and so communities need to be spied on and over-policed and feared and kept out of the country and blamed for every frickin' thing that goes wrong, right? So it's important to understand the different ways that white supremacy characterizes different peoples. And again, you can get more complex with this. I'm presenting you with a very simplified version of the theory, but yeah, so understanding this kind of helps us see how we're all oppressed in different ways, and we can also be complicit in oppressing each other. And so, for example, one of the things that Andrea Smith talks about is that Native American communities, again, where I come from, but you see this here as well, in the States and here, they have a history of enlisting in the military and fighting colonial wars in other parts of the world. And this, of course, is a response to chronic unemployment, chronic poverty, lack of education among Native American and First Nations folks, who don't necessarily see the connection to white supremacy, but think that this is a way that they can get access to training and skills and things that they otherwise wouldn't have, and so they do this. And of course, there's a lot of buying into the whole third pillar mentality of, you know, people just representing a danger to our way of being. So that's one of the ways that my people are complicit in oppressing others. Another example might be propagating what's called the model minority myth. Do folks know what that is, the model minority? I think a group like this probably knows better than I do what that myth is about. But the idea that to diffuse Islamophobia or anti-migrant racism, folks talk about how, you know, their communities are better than the average Canadian type of thing sometimes, that they work harder, you know, our folks work harder, we tend to achieve more, we're more highly educated, we're less likely to be engaged with criminal activity, goes the myth. You know, there's more stability in our communities and those kinds of things. And the problem with that is that you don't really interrogate exactly what Canadian values are and the cost of achieving that Canadian version of success. From the Indigenous point of view, that the model minority narrative is one that frames Canada as a benevolent, democratic, prosperous, peacekeeping nation, a pillar of sanctuary and justice in the world, which has never frickin' been true for us, or Black people for that matter. Or, you know, Asian folks that came over to work on the railroad, or all kinds of other examples, right? So that narrative really disappears Indigenous peoples and our history and our struggles, and it disappears the poverty and the lack of clean water in our communities, the suicide rates and so on. And it's the story of this nation of Canada that, despite stealing our lands and pursuing policies of genocide, even to this day, somehow magically brought peace and progress and prosperity to the people, right? I mean, which people is the question, right? So the main problem with the model minority narrative from an Indigenous point of view is that it buys into Canada's intentionally false image of itself, an image that it intentionally contrived for itself, right? And then sells to you offers to all of us. So that even people in our own communities who you would think would see through these lies start believing them, right? So the 3 pillars allows us to see how we can become complicit in each other's oppressions. It also tells us that we can't assume, this is another important point, that we can't assume that the problems in one community are the same as those in another community, or that they even stem necessarily from the same root causes. And so the solutions to our liberation are not always the same. And this was definitely a problem of my generation when I was coming up. I was brought up during the civil rights movement, during the American Indian movement in the States, and there was a lot of assumption that we could all use the same tactics and strategies to address the problems in our communities, but that didn't work out. And it needs a closer look. What exactly are our differences? What are similarities? Yes, but what are our differences? And what does that mean for how we address the issues that we're confronting and support each other in addressing the issues that we're confronting? So on that note, I want to get back to the idea of establishing friendships across our communities. Acknowledging as well our interconnectedness or our commonality of spirit. The more that we do that with each other, the more we make friends with each other, the more we learn about each other, of course, and the more we understand how we can work within our own communities in a way that's liberating for everyone, the better we can work with each other together as we lift each other up. So in summarizing, I just want to emphasize that there's a spiritual bonus I feel encoded in making friends, and a lot of us know it, right? It's not rocket science, right? There's this Wampanoag activist that I have worked with. He's a scholar and an activist, and there's a piece of writing that I really love from him when he talks about relationship building, and sometimes he uses the word alliance. But the quote that I offer that comes from him is, if this work of friendship making and all of that, if this work does not transform you, then you're not paying attention. And so one of the teachings that I hold dearly that come from my elders and wisdom keepers is that we can evolve spiritually and transform ourselves through relationships, right? We can allow our relationships to teach us how to be kinder, more compassionate, more generous human beings, how to connect with the other life forms on this planet, how to honor our ancestors. We can look to our relationships to grow, basically, to grow spiritually. And so that's the last notion I want to leave you with, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Zainab, for that beautiful reflection and reminder about the value of friendship, particularly, which I think is something we should constantly remind ourselves of. I wanted to introduce Aziza, and I just realized that I forgot her bio, which is...
And she's my sister, so she doesn't know enough about me.
Yeah, exactly. It's not one of those like sister Freudian things. But what I do know is that Aziza is a legal analyst. She has her LLM. Master's in Islamic law, specializing in Islamic law, and her JD from U of T. And she is an author. She's published in a variety of mainstream media publications, as well as in academic journals and anthologies. So please, Aziza.
Thank you, Khadija, for that extremely accurate from memory introduction. And thank you to my sister Zainab for your beautiful and powerful words expressing solidarity, but also complicating, I think, some of the simplistic assumptions that we make about solidarity, particularly during times of crisis like this. For those of us who are Muslims living in Canada, I think that it's impossible that we could have heard the news of what happened in Christchurch without it triggering memories and connections for us to the mosque massacre that happened in Quebec on January 29th, 2017, when another white supremacist, Alexandre Bissonnette, opened fire in a mosque at a time when he knew Muslims would be there in prayer, killing 6 and seriously injuring many others. This connection between the two events, indeed, is one that was made by the Christchurch shooter himself, who had inscribed the name of Alexandre Bissonnette on one of the weapons that he used in his attacks on the mosques in Aotearoa. However, in all of the conversations that we've been having about the connections between the mosque massacre in Christchurch and the mosque massacre in Quebec, one connection that we have tended to overlook is the fact that both of these acts of carnage occurred in settler colonial states that themselves have been constituted through acts of genocide. We tend to fixate on the fact that the Christchurch shooter identified himself as a fascist and to associate him with the racism of the far right, while we treat the structures of systemic racism endemic in the societies within which these massacres took place as a question of secondary or peripheral importance. And I think that this is really a complete reversal of the way that we, in fact, need to be approaching issues of racism. We need to start with the systemic and the structural, and then look at acts of hate as an emanation of those deeply rooted systems of racism. Otherwise, it's like looking at an ocean and only seeing the waves that are cracking the surface and wondering where they're coming from because we're not looking at the entire body of water that lies underneath. In Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, where the Christchurch shooter came from, in the United States, which has also seen recent acts of mass carnage in places of worship, the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the Charleston murders in a black church. These are all political systems that have been built on the foundational violence of genocide against Indigenous peoples. And as Zainab pointed out to us so clearly, these are not just questions of history, but these tactics of genocide continue into the present, not always through acts of massacres that kill people quickly, but through forms of violence that kill people slowly. For example, at Grassy Narrows, where the fact that there has been mercury poisoning in the land and the water, giving rise to extreme illnesses even for babies born into this world, that fact has been known for decades, and yet it hasn't been cleaned up. And our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had the gall to make fun of protesters who are calling this issue to his attention at a recent event. When we look at the history of anti-Indigenous genocide, that is the foundation upon which these settler states have been built, we see that they are intimately intertwined also with the logics of anti-Semitism, the logic of anti-Black racism, and the logic of Islamophobia. Before Christopher Columbus's pseudo-discovery of the Americas in 1492, the primary points of reference that European Christian powers had for thinking about difference and otherness, the primary others against whom they constituted their identities, were the figure of the Jew and the figure of the Muslim. So that, as Columbia University professor Gil Anajar writes in his book, The Jew, the Arab, A History of the Enemy, Jewish communities were represented as internal and religious enemies, while Muslims were represented as external and political enemies. And of course, this is a schematic and a simplification, but it captures something basic about the enemy thinking that didn't just arise with 9/11 as far as Muslims are concerned, but is embedded deeply in the formation of white identity. With the quote-unquote discovery of the New World, many of the stereotypes and tropes that had been developed in anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim polemics, for example, ideas about gender and sexual deviancy, ideas about impermissible religious difference, ideas about lack of purity of blood, ideas that had been developed in relationship with Jewish and Muslim communities in what would come to be called Europe, were transferred to the quote-unquote New World and applied to indigenous populations. So that even the doctrine of discovery, which is the racist foundations explaining how European powers could claim sovereignty over lands in which indigenous nations had lived and been sovereign for many thousands of years, this doctrine of discovery was itself based on pre-existing papal edicts permitting Christians to seize the land and property and bodies of non-Christians during the Crusades. Precedents that were established legally legitimizing the genocidal wars against indigenous nations who were represented as savages and barbaric, and therefore outside the bounds of international law and the limits it imposed on the conduct of warfare. Those precedents are now being revived to justify exceptional forms of violence in the war on terror, including explicitly in some of the military tribunals at Guantanamo Bay. And we also know that the proliferation of security powers that states have justified in the name of fighting the war on terror against Muslim terrorism have also been applied to suppress indigenous activism or land exercises of protecting their land and their waters from continuing colonial depredations. And so if we want to understand the way that Islamophobia and other forms of racism are operating, we cannot afford to ignore the connections with the foundational violences that sustain the colonial sovereignty of the state. The title of the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto was The Great Replacement. And like the Quebec mosque shooter Alexandre Bissonnette, it expresses a very deep-seated anxiety that white populations in places like Canada and New Zealand are being replaced. An anxiety that is itself based on an erasure of the fact that these white populations in these settler states are themselves the product of concerted efforts to replace the indigenous populations of those lands, concerted efforts to decimate the indigenous populations of those lands. And so while many analyses have fixated on the themes in the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto that correspond to memes of the far right, we have paid far less attention to how these themes that the Christchurch Shooter Manifesto is so obsessed with are not just the province of some fringe far-right racists, but they are anxieties that have been foundational to settler colonial discourse as well. For example, the anxiety that the manifesto starts with the question of birth rates. Birth rates, birth rates, birth rates, the manifesto says. This fear that white populations aren't replacing themselves adequately, and so Muslims and other invaders are overtaking them. This isn't something that has just arisen with the recent rise of the far right. It was the impetus for concerted initiatives in settler colonies to import white women from Britain and elsewhere to reproduce settler populations that colonizers felt weren't being reproduced quickly enough. The fear of racialized immigrants that both the Christchurch shooter and Alexandra Bissonnette were so obsessed with is not just something that's limited to the fringe and the far right now. It was the basis of historical immigration policies like the White New Zealand policy, the White Australia policy, the White Canada policy that explicitly imposed restrictions on the basis of race in immigration, and which continue today in non-explicit forms of racial discrimination that continue to operate in our immigration and refugee policies. The Christchurch shooter called himself a fascist, but we have to remember, as colonial intellectuals helped us to understand, that fascism is nothing but colonialism that was turned onto Europeans. And that when people who had been colonized saw the rise of fascism in Europe during the interwar period and during the war, they recognized it. They recognized the racial authoritarian rule. They recognized the concentration camps. They recognized those tactics and discourses of racism, because those were the very same tactics and discourses that had been applied against them and to justify their colonization, not only by European regimes that called themselves fascist, but even the European regimes that claimed to be fighting against fascism. White supremacy was something that transcended these political categories. And so for us today, who are facing the rise of the far right and thinking about how to address this increasingly visible tide of white supremacy, we have to be making those same connections today between what look like extreme forms of racism and the everyday normalized racism that's foundational to the structure of the state. Because otherwise, the danger is that in fighting some forms of racism, we end up rendering invisible the foundations of systemic racism and anti-Indigenous genocide, anti-Black slavery, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism that the state itself has been built on. It's particularly dangerous when we render invisible anti-Indigenous settler colonialism, because this perpetuates the logic of Indigenous disappearance that Zainab helped us to understand as one of the foundational pillars of white supremacy. And so, as we talk about Christchurch, as we talk about the waves of racism that break the surface, let us also remember the whole ocean that lies beneath. Because if anything needs replacing, it is these deeply rooted structures of white supremacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziza, and let's thank again Zainab and Aziza for their contributions to this discussion and helping to advance our thinking on the subject. Okay, I'll work on keeping the podium in one piece, and everyone can get started lining up. If you have questions or very brief comments that you would like to make, we have the microphone here. Well, these people have never been this shy. This is, of course, yes. No, yeah. Go ahead.
We can, yes.
And so wait, so that we can avoid this whole thing again, if anyone else is interested in asking a question, if you could please line up from now, so we don't need to also watch you make the trip down the runway like we have with Dr. Hayani.
Well, thank you very much for a very inspiring presentation. I would like to ask you two questions that really by way of provoking you and providing some discussion. It seems the framework you presented is so general, it tends to ignore the fact that there are some personalities or activities on the part of really those who even represent this and the regime that you are criticizing that are very honorable and noble. Remember, for example, the reaction of the Prime Minister of New Zealand. I think it's incredibly noble and commendable. So that within this system, although actually she is the product of the same system, but there are people who are determined not to allow the history or not to allow us to be the victim of that history. So there's always the possibility that, the change could come from within. Okay. So that's what I really like to think about, what do you think about, what the Prime Minister of New Zealand did and the fact that now there is a movement or there is a petition going on to make her like to nominate her for the Nobel Prize. The second question, with regard to this friendship issue, which is very, very important. I feel sometimes, whether natives or others, whether again intentionally or unintentionally, they tend to work to perpetuate this racism. And I want to mention particularly here the case of some few years ago, like the Zionist movement in Canada, invited a representative from the indigenous communities to go and visit Israel, and they visited settlements that are established at the expense of the native Palestinians. So I feel, for example, in a state of feeling communality or solidarity with the native Palestinians, those people allow themselves to be supporters of the very forces that oppress them in Canada.
Sorry, Professor Hayani, I just want to jump in as the moderator to note that if you're witnessing individual indigenous peoples who are participating in anti-Palestinian dispossession, then you have to equally acknowledge the many, many Muslims and Arabs who perpetuate and who benefit from settler colonialism here. And like I did mention, and I'll remind you again that in the wake of the Muslim ban, some of the biggest presence at the rally following it were indigenous groups who chanted "No Muslim ban on stolen land," and so I think like we've seen in Christchurch and in Quebec as well. So I do just want to jump in with just as a moderator.
Well, I just want to really address this. Where sometimes the danger of generalization, and two, the danger of ignoring the fact that sometimes, people who really were the victims of oppression, they tend to collaborate with the very people who are oppressing them, or they are kind of the source of this oppression.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm actually not upset or offended that you've talked about these Zionist-sponsored tours to Palestine. So we have noted that in the indigenous community, and we've been aware of it for some time. The leaders that tend to go over are folks that are involved with the band, the chief and council, the band system, the Indian Act people, as we call them, the Indian Act leaders. And it is hard to generalize about Indian Act leadership, but there have been people taken down in their communities because of this kind of behavior. And as has been mentioned, there have been protests that have taken place in First Nations communities by people at the grassroots level who do not appreciate this kind of complicity. And it's definitely an issue in our communities. So yes, and I think it's fine to recognize that, just as I mentioned other examples of complicity that can happen, this is another example of that. I think that Indigenous folks now, because I remember maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, not as many people were aware of the dynamics of Palestine being an occupied territory and the genocide being committed against Palestinian people. I think many more of us are aware now, and that has to do with activists within our own community. So yes, that's fine, that we can recognize that, and absolutely. I wanted to also talk about the Prime Minister of New Zealand. It's really interesting because I do feel like there's a lot of really appropriate and good responses that she's had to this massacre. And in some ways she models the kind of leadership that many of us would like to see. At the same time, she also goes around saying things like, this is not us, this is not New Zealand, and it's a bit of a contradiction because I'm sure Maori folks are like, huh? And I appreciate the fact that Maori, just as the way that many Indigenous folks here say, not on Indigenous land, or, as treaty people, our end of the treaties that we made with the European settlers do not allow the kind of racism and Islamophobia and anti-migrant crap that goes on. That is our responsibility. That is not something that we are okay with. This violates our laws and it violates our values. So there are a lot of people standing up about that. So, and the third thing I just wanted to say about the Prime Minister of New Zealand, so there's those contradictions in the way she's managing the situation and the way she's speaking about it. And I also noticed that within the mainstream press, there's this centering of her as the focus of attention as opposed to some of the issues that we're talking about today, as opposed to the victims and the families of the victims and the way forward, and they just want to kind of center her and put her up on a pedestal as, this is the real issue type of thing, or this is what we should really be focused on. So, those are my thoughts on the questions that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayani. I also found it beautiful and touching to watch the way that Prime Minister Ardern responded to the mosque massacre, and I wish that Justin Trudeau had responded in a fraction of the same way to the Quebec mosque massacre. But I think the fact that her response is being upheld as the acme, right, or the highest point of how a leader can respond to this kind of incident shows the inherent contradictions and limits that are embedded in these kinds of responses. So for example, as progressives, much of what we seem to ask for when there's a mosque massacre or active Islamophobic violence or other active racist violence is to label it terrorism. What is terrorism? Terrorism is defined as almost an inherently illegal or inherently illegitimate form of violence in a way that separates these acts of mass carnage from the systems of racial violence that form the basis for the sovereignty of the state in the first place, that is then appealed to as the body that is supposed to be punishing terrorism. So it separates the violence of the far right, represented as exceptional, from the racial violence of the sovereign state itself. So with the Christchurch massacre, we've heard it referred to many times in international media as the most deadly incident that has ever happened in New Zealand. Well, that ignores massacres of Maori that occurred in the New Zealand wars, through which the settler state seized large tracts of Maori land, so that now, even now, right, with this progressive prime minister, Maori are still reduced to only 5% of their land base. And when they engage in processes for for rectification of colonial injustices, the most they receive as compensation is 1 to 3% of the value of their land. And so it's actually very dangerous when we're asking for these forms of far-right violence to be called terrorism, because what ends up happening is that it bolsters and expands the infrastructure of counterterrorism that ends up primarily being applied in both New Zealand and Canada, mostly against Muslims, as well as indigenous land and water protectors, the first and only targets of New Zealand's counterterrorism law have been Maori and environmental activists. And so it's so important for us to understand the limits of someone like Jacinda Ardern's response to Christchurch, so that we don't end up thinking that the solutions to these forms of racism are state institutions that are actually part of the problem. And that's why the type of analysis that Zainab laid out, understanding the different forms and the way that different forms of white supremacy interact, is so vital for shaping our approach to anti-racism, because then otherwise we just end up miring ourselves further in the quicksand of racism, even as we think we're escaping it. Oh, and just also again on the question of Palestine, I think that as Muslims and who are on this land, that we can't expect forms of solidarity that we don't give, and that as people who are continuing to directly benefit from settler colonization of this land, that's the relationship that we need to focus on fixing before we can expect other forms of solidarity in return.
Timothy?
Thank you. In the disturbing white supremacist rhetoric, I've often heard references to white genocide and reverse crusade. And it's, of course, terribly and tragically ironic that a white supremacist would use the language of crusade and genocide, because these refer to crimes that white people and colonial powers commit and have committed. But I was just going to ask both of you for your thoughts about the history of this language, of these concepts of a white genocide and a reverse crusade, and also comment on how widespread these are in sort of transnational white supremacism and ethno-nationalism.
I don't know that I'm able to speak to all of your questions, but I think, again, from my perspective, I've seen this kind of, it's not the exact same rhetoric, but I've seen this in my lifetime before. For example, during the civil rights movement, when black folks outnumbered white folks in certain kinds of certain states, like Mississippi, for example, and the violence was so much worse in places where blacks did outnumber whites, because, of course, if blacks were awarded the vote, white people were afraid that they would be treated the way they had been treating black people for centuries. So again, all I can speak to is that it's not new. I can't really speak to I'm not in a position to speak to the other questions that you raised. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think part of the problem is that when we are analyzing the increasingly visible far right, we look at these memes and these certain phrases that they use, and then we exceptionalize them and we disconnect them from the deeper logics that have informed systems of colonialism and white supremacy, which I think we see in the examples that Zainab gave. Right. So the idea that that white populations were subjected to existential threat from non-white people in the lands that they themselves were colonizing, right? It's not just something that's arisen through the idea of white genocide. It's the foundation of much of the international laws of war, which permitted weapons and modes of genocidal warfare to be used against the savage tribes in the places that people were colonizing, because the idea was that, well, these people don't respect any of the bounds of civilized warfare, and so unless we throw everything we have at them, we're going to be eradicated, right? It's the basis for the idea of preemptive strikes in the war on terror, which is what justified the illegal invasion of Iraq. And so I think that this phrase of white genocide, it's really getting to deeper ideas that have long been embedded in white supremacist discourse about rights of preemption, rights of white entitlement to use violence in order to protect themselves against non-white populations. It's interesting that actually in 1905 there was another racist murder in New Zealand that hasn't really been talked about in much of the media coverage on this. I haven't seen it alluded to at all, when a white supremacist shot an elderly Chinese man who he didn't know in the middle of the street. He shot him dead, and he also publicly stated what his motives were, like the Christchurch shooter did in his manifesto over a decade later. And in it he said, I shot this Asian man, this China man in the street because I wanted to tell my British brothers that we will not be overrun by the Asian invaders. I did nothing wrong. This was my right. Even though he didn't say white genocide, it's the exact same logic. And so I think we really need to look to these deeper histories and see how these ideas reconstitute themselves in order to really understand what's going on.
Uncle?
The government of Quebec just a week or so ago passed a law that all employees working for the government, they are prohibited from wearing symbols that could be associated with any religion or anything like that. And theoretically, it is against all religions, whether it be Jews, Christians, Sikhs, or the Muslims. But it really started when people started wearing hijab, and it was more against the Muslims than against anybody else. And that, in spite of the fact that there was this massacre in Christchurch, there was this massacre in Quebec Mosque, and such a feeling going around, and perhaps you may wish to comment on that, because I feel that that again is an example of racism, and nothing short of that.
So sorry, Pervez Uncle, just to clarify, you want the speakers to comment on the racism in Quebec outside of just the mosque shooter, but in that legislation, for example?
Yes.
Okay.
That's definitely racism, and in fact, I think that's the type of racism that it's more important for us to focus on, because it's the type of racism that gets embedded in our laws and our policies. And it's not just the Quebec law. At the federal level, for example, we have a law called the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which picks out certain forms of gendered violence that are stereotypically associated with Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, and calls them barbaric, and says that they need to be subjected to special punishment. And so how can we be surprised when the far right goes and holds protests and holds signs saying, we don't want Muslims here, they bring honor killings, no more barbaric honor killings, no more barbaric Sharia, when those very same kinds of ideas are being legitimated in our laws in the name of supposedly progressive values like feminism or saving women. When we look at the genealogy of the Quebec law, as you said, it's very clear that the targets have always been Muslims, and the other restrictions on other displays of religious practice from different religious traditions are really just there in order to try and avoid allegations that this is overtly discriminatory. Legally or constitutionally, it would still almost certainly be found to contravene constitutional protections of freedom of religion and equality, which is why Quebec has preemptively said they're going to use the notwithstanding clause. But I think it's also important for us to appreciate that Indigenous spiritual traditions have also been under attack since the foundations of the settler colonial state. And this has been validated even in very recent Supreme Court decisions, which have said, for example, that Indigenous nations that were trying to protect pieces of land that were important for their spiritual practice, that they didn't qualify under the constitutional protections of freedom of religion, because religion is supposed to protect things that are spiritual, right, and not grounded in land and material things. And so this really reflects a Christian-centric understanding of religion that then judges all other religious traditions as being deviant from this paradigmatic definition of what constitutes religion, and it's still used in order to marginalize and oppress different communities by representing their religious traditions as non-normative. And we're seeing this in Quebec as well, with the Charter of Values, for example, which said that, which had proposed that women, for example, wouldn't be allowed to wear hijabs when delivering or receiving public services. Instead, they could wear a pendant with a star and a crescent on them, as if those are interchangeable things for Muslims, right? The hijab, it's not a sign of religious identity, it's a form of religious practice that transcends public and private. It's not just about saying you're Muslim, but it's about living your life in a certain way in the world. But because that doesn't map onto Christian-centric and Eurocentric definitions of what religion is, it's considered to be deviant, and therefore that's used against these communities in order to justify their marginalization from public life. And so thank you for bringing up this Quebec bill in our discussion, because I think that so clearly shows that the problem of Islamophobia, it's not just about hate crimes in the way that it's normally framed. It's not even just about massacres, but it's about all of these ways that we've normalized in our society of rendering Muslims deviant and therefore able to be shoved to the margins of our public.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really well spoken. Thank you very much. I just also wanted to talk just very briefly about the parallels, again, historically, about the impositions of, so the spiritual, religious or ceremonial practices among Indigenous people, as we all know, were made illegal for a very long time in the history of Canada. And so that meant that a lot of the way folks dressed, or the medicine items and the beadwork and things like that people basically wore or carried with them were made illegal. Not that people gave them up, but were made illegal. And I also wanted to bring up the parallel of the missionaries, the residential schools, and the imposition of, dress and hairstyles and all that kind of thing on children. So again, we have this history of, government and a Christian-informed government telling us how we can and cannot dress and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Is this being recorded? Because some of those comments were so fantastic. I wish I had them. You know that when you speak so fast, I can't get them down.
It is being recorded.
Okay.
So your prayer has been answered.
No, I want to thank you for drawing. What's happening?
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm too short.
It doesn't care
It's
for
a
you.
misogynistic
I don't know.
mic, probably.
I want to thank you for drawing our attention to this, and I'll follow up on it, because I could immediately see a framework where all of the isms and phobias could be in the top. No, I can't. In the where you have the anti-black racism. And I also want to thank Aziza for being so inclusive in her comments and including all of the isms and phobias, including anti-Semitism. And I guess that's also my way of saying, or wanting to go into some guidelines on how you truly build friendships and relationships. Because what happens when you do build those relationships and truly become friends, then you can talk about the difficult issues and become truly allies. Now, allies tends to be a problematic word at times. Some people say, don't just say allies, say activists. Others say, don't just say allies, say friends. And I guess I'd like to use all the words. I like to think that my allies are not just on an ad hoc, self-interested one issue, although people do form coalitions for that reason. People can have a coalition and then fight for one issue that helps out, but in fact, deep down on some of the tougher issues, haven't developed enough trust and friendships. So I'll just make one more comment and then ask you to address that question of strategies to truly develop friendships, because it takes years and that trust. And I think the issue of Israel, Jews, Muslims, Palestinians, Zionism, anti-Zionism gets very conflated in that sense. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that trip that was referred to was after one of the Aboriginal leaders basically was recorded saying Hitler should have finished the job. And most of the people that I work with, as are what I hope I can say my friends and allies and activists in this room know, is that there are many who would join in the kind of analysis and not be wanting to take people to illegal settlements, but having a much deeper analysis as friends, so that we can somehow figure out a way out of the challenges that face us, when often some of these issues get so conflated politically. Everything is political, I know that, but fundamentally, if we want equality, social justice, equity, and to dismantle the systemic barriers and the colonialist, oppressive structures that we all live under, we need more good friends and allies, all of us. And so how do you develop those strong, some of the strategies which we have struggled with and are still struggling with, and denounce what has to be denounced? Because when we do that, all of us know we risk our credibility in our own communities. But if we're in it for the duration, we don't care what the racists in our own community say.
Okay.
So that's enough said.
Okay.
And
thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much for your
Karen wants
insights.
tips on making friends, if you can offer any.
No, you know what I mean. To deal with the really, really tough
No,
issues, basically.
absolutely, yeah.
You know what I mean. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. So did you want to speak to that, Zainab? Because I think this is an important part of your own philosophy, the political work of friendships.
Right, and that's why I use the term friendship, is because you kind of assume that everybody knows how to make a friend and how to keep friends. And I don't know that you can develop a set of do's and don'ts or guidelines, right? I mean, situations are fluid, every friendship is unique, and all of that sort of thing, right? So I don't know if I want to do that, but what I can do is kind of look to some of the examples that I've seen in my lifetime, and there are so freaking many, but the ones in the work that I'm doing right now, I work at the Children's Peace Theater, and we have a project where we're working specifically with African descended and Indigenous young people, and it kind of I find it very inspiring that they don't need a lot of guidance around, coming together and co-creating artistically and allowing those processes of co-creation, creating art, creating dance, creating music, or whatever it is they're doing through those processes to develop these really close relationships and to learn from each other and to take the time to listen to each other's stories, draw the parallels, talk about the differences, and just get to know each other better. So I don't know what more I can say about that because, friendship is like, I don't know what, to say. I mean, we all have friends and we all, there's also Leanne Simpson, darn it, I can't remember which book she put it in. I think it's the Dancing on Turtle's Back, where she talks about the notion of treaty making, and she talks about how she learned about the indigenous concept of treaty making through breastfeeding her baby. And so that idea of kind of like that call and response, that interaction, that nonverbal communication that happens between a mother and child, who actually do care about, less the child, but less the baby, but that comes later, but are really invested in each other's wellness and happiness and all of this stuff. And so she talks about those cues that go back and forth that nurture both, and the relationship transforms over time, right? And so you're picking up different cues and responding differently as time goes on. So it's a very fluid process. I don't know what more to say about that. Thank you.
I think that something that's so important is openness to being criticized and being called out. One of the most important things in the Andrea Smith article that Zainab talked about, and I want to reiterate this, is the way that people who are subjected to one or who are subjugated by one form of racializing logic can still be complicit and be enforcing other pillars of the white supremacist structure. And so even when we think that we're engaging in activism for our community, we still might be upholding the system of white supremacy as a whole. For example, when we engage in activism against genocides abroad, but act as if Canada itself isn't built on genocide and that we have genocide under our own feet here. And in many ways, as much as we hate being on the receiving end of racism, it's still easier to think of yourself in an uncomplicated way as a victim and not also as being in many ways a perpetrator of other logics of white supremacy. And I also think that because we have such a hate crime centric vision of what racism is, we've made it so personal, right? That when people get called out for perpetuating racism, they take it as an assault on themselves as a person, instead of also understanding it as part of a systemic structure that we need to all be called out in some ways in order to learn and to grow, and in order for us to be able to work together to dismantle the systems that ultimately aren't really benefiting anyone except for a handful of people who are benefiting from white male privilege. So for me, for example, one of the most important learning experiences in my life was when we were organizing a series at NUR on forms of racial exclusion in Canada, and we had invited an Indigenous speaker from the Tyendinaga Mohawks. And he pointed out to me how problematic it was that we were orienting the whole program around ideas of inclusion in Canada, when for many Indigenous nations, inclusion is just another form of assimilation, right? Which is one of the sides of genocide. And so appreciating the way that white supremacy and racism has so many different logics and works in different ways against different communities, and appreciating that the way that we might have experienced racism isn't the way that all communities experience racism, and in fact it's that diversity of tactics that is what makes white supremacy so powerful and so durable, right? Its flexibility is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of its strength. once we appreciate that, then we have to understand that any one of us as an individual can't understand the structure of white supremacy as a whole just from our own experiences or from our own community's experiences. And so that openness and acknowledgement of the inherent limits of any one of our knowledge, I think, has to be the starting point for any relationship of friendship that we're hoping to build.
I just want to gauge how many more questions there are. So Bill, and then you, and then was there anyone else? Oh, no, man. Okay. Okay. So I mean, yeah, we still have about 20
I just wonder if I could speak to this, something I learned from young people that I work with, this term of, because we've worked with the term calling out for a really long time, and young people are now using the term calling in when it comes to folks who are oppressed in different ways, that you don't want to call them out so much as you want to call them in. And the idea that, allowing people to change, allowing them the opportunity to change their heart and change their mind, because our minds are informed by our hearts, by allowing, just gently allowing people to be who they need to be, reminding them that, it's safe to change, because, I mean, a lot of people who, hold opinions that are considered to be complicit, fear, just like anybody fears changing their mind. You fear losing your friends, you fear losing your community, you fear losing your support. And so there's this idea of being gentle with people who do who are experiencing a different kind of oppression, but being gentle with them and allowing them to see, again, these different logics at work, and ensuring them that, we're still, you're not going to lose anything by extending and extending this hand of friendship and becoming friends and working on this relationship. Take it or leave it.
I just wanted to suggest that it's always very helpful, I think, to include plutocracy and patriarchy in discussing these issues. For example, to go back to the issue of white genocide. White genocide as an idea that is emerging somewhat in people around Trump. It's probably best associated, or worst associated, with a man named Michael Savage, if people want to look further into that. In the case of the other issue with the rise of the alt-right is a recent book that covers a great many of the emergent changes that might evolve in the next few years, particularly with respect to the notion of crucified Christianity. That can be most closely associated in terms of powerful people with Vice President Pence. So anything that helps in making people aware of that is most helpful. On the other hand, we can see in the response of people to the various discussions taking place at IPAC, the political action committee that's associated with very hardline Israeli policies and American Israel action, that we get really incredibly vicious attacks on Ilhan Omar, and she's someone who is extremely important at this time, and it's I think very, very important to give as much support for her as possible. In this case, we have a kind of a triple win, because she's the first representative in the United States of a Muslim from Black Africa, and she's of course an immigrant and a Muslim, and much younger than the dominant people. If you've noticed, people like Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have made rather appalling speeches to IPAC, and one can look at the range of things that are said for a rather quick sense of what these people are on about as apart from the discussions that take place, the way they're presented in the media.
Sorry, Bill. Bill, I'm just
That's it? I
being
finished.
conscious of the time. No, so I mean, if you had specific, if there's something specific.
Well, my opening question is just to give a sense of why I am so interested in trying to keep attentive. I didn't mention plutocracy enough. For example, when...
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Okay.
One quick thing. The Secretary of Education in the United States just eliminated funding of handicapped Olympics. And so someone then immediately said she saved almost half the price of her own yacht. So that's the kind of thing that is helpful sometimes in talking about people like Trudeau, to connect the issue of plutocracy as well, because I think he's beginning to look like a jackal or oligarch. And these various groups now are becoming discredited for a multiple reasons, including their vicious patriarchy.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, I think it's also important that we recognize that plutocracy is built off stolen Indigenous lands and resources. How much was it that Art Manuel had said that Canada would have to pay in reparations to Indigenous nations if they were to compensate for all of the wealth that they've gained from processes of Indigenous dispossession and genocide? So I think so much of the time when we talk about plutocracy and the wealth gap, we ignore the issue that wealth is itself the product of colonial processes of extraction, and so I think it's really vital that we connect those two.
Yeah.
Sorry, Zainab, I feel like you were...
Well, I just wanted to note that this isn't, again, anything new in terms of the ruling classes, ruling elites sort of dividing folks from each other and laughing, at the fact that their strategies and their, these three pillars that people are fighting each other and taking each other down, and that the Republicans and the Democrats, for example, have different ways of doing it. They're still representative of the ruling class. So again, we had laws during the colonial period that kept African descended folks and Indigenous folks from talking to each other, doing business, trading with each other, marrying each other, and that kind of thing, because it represented a threat to them. There were Indigenous nations that were played off against each other and all that kind of thing. And so, they're very happy when we become complicit and we start fighting with each other. And they have different ways of making sure that we do that with each other. And I think we need to be vigilant and aware of the fact that does not serve our interests. Yeah.
5 minutes ago, I didn't even know what plutocracy meant, and now I have a very nicely complicated understanding of it, so thank you. So we have two more questions, please.
Hello, my name is Nancy, and
Hi, Nancy.
I'm happy that three women have created this event, and happy to be here. So I guess I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. I'm coming from a background of biological anthropology.
Okay.
And I'm also a Baha'i, so I'm not going to talk about politics. I'm thinking about our history and our future as a world, as people. There are many forces of division in the world today. As we all know, they're created. They're not generally natural. In many cases, they're the agenda of a few who are benefiting from this division. And in other cases, such as what happened in Christchurch, they seem to be the result of fear. When that fear can be the result of a lack of education, but that we have to combat those forces of division, and we also have to look at our history as people, because throughout recorded and before recorded history, probably all of our countries, our nations, our peoples have conquered somebody at some point. We can't look at all of them. The more recent ones, some of them can, we can have reparations for them, and others can be acknowledged and taught in history, but what I want to say is that what we most need for all of these problems, they all have the same cause, really, and it's disunity. You talked about the heart, you talked about making friends, and that's what we need. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as different people, because in this world we're one people. We are one humanity. We're not just friends, we're actually all related to each other. I'm speaking as a biological anthropologist here. Genetically, we are all actually related to each other. We're all cousins. It may be as far apart as 50-second cousins, but we're all cousins. And so we're all family. And the solution to all our problems are to treat each other as one family. So that's really all I want to say. This is, the divisions in the world are artificial. They've been created, and therefore they can be taken apart.
Thank you, Nancy. Any comment on this big reveal that we're all cousins?
Yeah, really? Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've heard that message in a way. I don't find that message always as helpful as people think it is. I feel that, for example, there was a time when I was working with someone who got very upset when folks wanted to talk about white supremacy, because he started talking about, the fact that everybody's conquered everybody else, and, that the Aztecs or something conquered, the people in Central America and Mexico at one point, and how come we don't talk about that? And I'm like, it's got nothing to do with the oppression that we're living under today, right? I'm not living under Aztec oppression right now, right? We're not, it's the problem isn't Aztec supremacy, right? It's white supremacy. So I'm not sure how that argument, really helps us clarify what's going on in our lives and how to respond to it, number one. The whole we are one thing, it's interesting. I know that there are people who want to emphasize how, our similarities and all of this kind of stuff. And yes, there are a lot of similarities, but our cultural differences do matter to us too. These are part of, our identity. It's about the lands that we relate to, and our particular stories that define who we are. And I'm not saying that that makes one superior to the other, of course not. But these are still, and though there's such value in maintaining these identities and these different, and honoring our differences as well. We can learn from each other, we can grow from that, as I have spoken about in the relationship making process, right? So I don't think it's really helpful, again, to kind of, de-emphasize our differences. I think it's rather more helpful to emphasize and celebrate our differences in a real way, in a way that recognizes, our individuality as mattering and making us special to each other. Take it or leave it.
I also think, while it's extremely important to recognize, obviously, that racial distinctions aren't real, they're based on fake biology, the distinctions that racism has produced are real, and they have deep material consequences. So we're not biologically different, but we're situated economically very differently, politically very differently, socially very differently. And we often say that these are the products of ignorance and that the solution is more education, but the problem is that so much of our education has been devoted towards making these distinctions seem normal and the product of the inherent characteristics of the communities that are being oppressed, rather than the systems that have been created in order to oppress them. So, for example, the fact that in our schools we don't learn about the history and present of Indigenous genocide means that for many of our media commentators and many of our public commentators, it's Indigenous nations that get blamed for being poor and for being traumatized, rather than the colonial system that continues to inflict trauma upon them. And so recognizing that racial distinctions are constructed, of course, it means that we can construct it differently, but it doesn't mean that because they're not real, that they don't have real effects. A house, for example, is constructed. It means it can be built differently, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have material reality and effects in the world. And so understanding the artificiality of racial distinctions is a starting point, but it can't be the finish point for our analysis, because otherwise you end up in sort of a Maxime Bernier position where he was objecting to measures in the budget to address racism by saying, well, racial distinctions are artificial, and so it's actually a form of reverse racism to be engaging in affirmative action for the benefit of certain communities that have experienced historical racism. Race is false, but racism is real, and that's what we need to acknowledge and understand, so that we can begin to unpack the forces that gave rise to something like the massacre at Christchurch.
Okay, last question, Oman. Make it good.
Sure. Thank you so much for your insight. I just wanted to make one observation. For me, I think this incident has brought me close to like New Zealanders, and I think.
Well, they are your cousins, so.
Sure, yeah. And I've seen like the hakas and like those things kind of floating around on the social media. And I guess my question is, I remember one of the videos that came up after the massacre was of a rugby player who was very emotional about like how this is not us. He was in New Zealand. He represented the New Zealand rugby team, I believe. And like his words were like really powerful, and I think they will remain, like they will stick in our heads for a long time, because those are the kinds of voices that came up to kind of give a counter narrative. And I wonder if you have some like closing remarks about like, how maybe what is it that like common people, like young people can take from those kinds of initiatives. So thank you.
Noman's looking for you to give him some hope, so.
No pressure, eh? Just final comment. I don't know what more I can say that I haven't already said. I just feel like, honestly, we're all together on this land right now, and none of us are going away, and we need to find a way to connect with each other and recognize the connections that exist. In an article that I wrote a while ago for Massacre magazine, it was titled "How to Thrive Despite White Supremacy." And what I advocated in that article, which is something that I do with my own activism and my own artistic work and my own community work, which is that I'm really less interested in trying to convince white folks to change their minds and their hearts and minds. I'm much more interested in supporting folks of color, migrants, queer folks, trans folks, indigenous folks. I'm interested in supporting youth as well, in empowering themselves so that they can stop believing in their own inferiority, so that they can rise. And I really trust the relationship building process in terms of finding answers. Maybe I'm a little too trusting in that, I don't know, but I do trust that process, and that's where I'm at. Like, I'm not I mean, I used to be an activist very much. I mean, I used to be one of those, I mean, I'm still an activist, but the kind of folks that went out, you know, the land defenders and folks that would block roads and these kinds of things, and I spent a lot of time doing that. And it definitely has made changes. It has its contribution to make towards change. But for me, I feel like I have this spiritual calling, and I would advise everybody to kind of connect to their own spirit and think about their own spiritual calling, about how they can contribute to transforming our relationships to each other and to the land. And so that's where I'm coming from, is how can I support folks, especially the priorities for us. If you want to change the future, my elders always said, work with young people. Right? They're the ones that are going to be living that change. And so that's where my interest is, you know, like all this stuff that goes on around us, it's going to continue going on around us. And I really feel like I want to be a part of building something different, as opposed to constantly being at war with folks. So again, that's where I'm coming from. So if that's inspirational, take it and run with it.
Thank you for bringing up that video, Noman, because I think that the entire premise of this panel has been to challenge this idea that massacres like Christchurch and Quebec, that this is not us. I think the fact that those kinds of framings are so appealing speak to this desire that still exists to maintain a sense of innocence about the racial histories of these states, and that so much of the shock that attends these kinds of events is precisely because of a kind of loss of an innocence that we never should have been able to possess in the first place. And so I think that in the wake of events like what happened at Christchurch, it really behooves us to think critically about the blinders that exist that allow us to be surprised when racist violence happens in a place like Christchurch or Quebec, and to think about how those same blinders are still operating in many of the frameworks and narratives that we use to respond to such events, which only guarantee that the substrata of racism that produced them will be able to continue to exist under the surface and exploding over it once in a while with tragic consequences.
You asked if any questions. Can I make a quick statement?
Oh,
Classic John.
This is, for those who don't know John, this is classic John. So meet John.
Firstly, we have to look strategically at the fact men who care, hopefully all the men here, have to understand we're not more equal than women. We are less important than women, actually, so that's the strategy we have to get through to men. Secondly, we have to sort out why the heck white people think we're more important than other cultures when we all came out of Africa. And thirdly, we have to accept we do not have democracy, because if we do have democracy, we do not have class, of which was mentioned just now. And without looking at that, I don't feel personally that we're ever going to get anywhere. Because when you've got class and when you've got money dictating, then you only look at power. Thank you.
Okay, but John, it's also not just about class, and that's what we've been saying on this panel.
No, I meant we got to get rid of that mentality, because if you've got democracy, you don't have class. That's what I'm saying.
And there you have it, the final word on white supremacy and patriarchy from our everyone's favorite white man, John Quarterly. Thank you. So I didn't mean for everyone to clap for him, but thank you, John. Did either of you want to just say anything to close off? Or, I mean, we're already at 4:30, but if you had some burning comment left unsaid. Okay, well then, I will take this opportunity to thank you both very much. Zainab, thank you for teaching us about the political work that's friendship, and more so showing us in your generosity by being present with us, by sharing our grief and sharing your grief and sharing your wisdom with us in a way that we deeply appreciate. And I think it's something that we can take to heart as mostly Muslim settlers here about the ways that we can participate in meaningful friendship and allyship with Indigenous peoples and all peoples who are oppressed by the system. So thank you so much, Zainab, for teaching me, and I think for teaching all of us. If you'll join me in. And thank you also, Aziza. You weren't bad either.
Feeling the sisterly love.
And at that, I will, if anyone wanted to get maybe the reference, at least for the visual that you shared, Dr. Andrea Smith's visual, maybe they can just ask you about it later, or I don't know if you want to announce it. Please continue helping yourself to tea, coffee, cookies, water, and safe travels. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.